The advertisement was not much to look at. It had been pinned to the community board inside the Millfield, Ohio post office for so long that the edges had gone soft and brown, the ink faded to the color of old rust. Most people walked past it without a second glance. It was the kind of notice that belonged to another world, a faraway world of wide skies and hard soil, and men who worked from dark to dark and still found themselves short of everything that mattered. Eliza Calloway had walked past it 100 times herself. She was not the kind of woman who read mail-order bride advertisements. She was a school teacher. She had her mother's composure and her father's stubbornness in a small but tidy life in a town where everyone knew her name and expected certain things of her and was generally not disappointed. She graded papers by lamplight. She walked to church on Sunday mornings with her hat pinned straight and her gloves buttoned. She had plans, modest plans, the kind that asked little of the world and expected even less in return, the kind of plans that fit neatly inside the life that had been built around her and did not require her to imagine anything too far beyond the horizon she could already see. But plans have a way of dying quietly the way fires do when the wood runs out. Her father died on a Tuesday in April, and by Friday she understood that the man she had loved and trusted her entire life had kept two sets of books, one for appearances, one for the truth. The truth was ugly in the particular way of things that have been kept hidden for a long time, not dramatic, not villainous, just the accumulated weight of decisions made in desperation and pride, each one small enough to seem manageable at the time, and catastrophic in aggregate. The truth was a number she could not say out loud without her throat closing. It represented every decision he had made in the final 3 years of his life, every loan he had taken, and every investment he had misjudged, and every gamble he had lost dressed up in the polite financial language of promissory notes and second mortgages and letters from creditors that had been arriving for months and going directly into a drawer he kept locked. She owed everything and had nothing. The house would go, the furniture would follow. The small savings her mother had left her, already spoken for before she even knew they existed, already committed against obligations she had not known were hers to carry. And then there was Edmund Harcastle. Edmund was 51 years old and he smelled of tobacco and a particular brand of cologne that he applied with the confidence of a man who had never been told he was using too much. He had been a business associate of her father's in the way that a hawk is an associate of field mice, present at the periphery patient waiting for the particular vulnerability that would make itself available eventually if you simply outlasted the resistance. He came to the house 4 days after the funeral, dressed in his good coat, hat, in his hands expression arranged into something he probably believed resembled sympathy. He told her he was prepared to settle her father's debt in full. The price was her hand in marriage. Eliza had stood very still in the parlor of the house that was no longer hers and looked at this man, this gray-templed, thick-fingered, already twice-widowed man whose two previous wives had died in their 30s and whose household staff turned over with a frequency that people in Millfield had long since stopped remarking on, because it had become simply a known fact like the weather and understood with perfect clarity what was being offered and what was being demanded. It was not a proposal, it was a transaction. She was the asset being transferred to settle an account. She told him she needed time to consider. She had no intention of giving him anything but silence. That night she sat at her father's desk for the last time going through the papers. She had been avoiding the ones in the locked drawer whose keys she had found tucked inside his watch case. She was hoping with a specific, irrational hope of someone who has already done the arithmetic and doesn't believe the answer that some overlooked account or forgotten policy might change the numbers. Nothing did. She went through the same drawer for the third time when her hand touched something she did not recognize. A small folded piece of paper tucked beneath a stack of outdated receipts placed there deliberately, not misplaced, but left. She unfolded it carefully. It was a copy of an advertisement, handwritten in her father's careful script, copied out as if he had wanted to remember it or perhaps wanted her to find it. The ink was fresh, not recent, but fresher than the other papers written within the last several months. Rancher in Redstone, Nebraska seeks a wife. Honest work. Hard land. A man who means what he says. Write to R. Hargrove, General Delivery, Redstone, Nebraska. Eliza read it twice. Then she sat back in her father's chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time. She was 26 years old. She had never been west of Columbus. She had never been on a train for longer than 4 hours, never cooked over an open fire, never spent a night somewhere she didn't know at least 3 people by their first names. She had been raised to be sensible, to be careful, to trust the structures that civilization had built around ordinary lives, and to work within them rather than around them. She had done everything right as far as she knew, and it had brought her to a locked drawer and a dead father and a man who smelled of too much cologne, waiting for her answer. Every sensible, careful, civilized part of her said to put the paper down. She wrote back the same night. She wrote 2 drafts. The first was careful and hedged and full of qualifications. The second was simpler. She said she was 26, a school teacher, in good health, willing to work hard and serious in her inquiry. She said she understood the arrangement was practical rather than romantic, and that this suited her present circumstances. She folded it, addressed it to R. Hargrove at General Delivery in Redstone, Nebraska, and walked to the post office before she could think about it further. She did not sleep well that night or for several nights after. But she noticed that her mind, which had been circling the problem of Edmund Hardcastle and the debt and the locked drawer with the exhausting repetition of something that has no exit, had quieted somewhat. She had done something. It might come to nothing. But she had opened a door, and the knowledge of that was enough to make the walls feel less close. The reply came in 11 days, which was faster than she had expected and shorter than she had hoped. Miss Calloway, your letter received. If you are serious, come. I will meet the westbound train at Redstone on the 15th of July. C. Hargrove. No warmth, no reassurance, no description of himself or the land or what she might expect to find there. Just the bare bones of a proposition from a man who apparently saw no reason to dress things up or soften their edges for a stranger's comfort. She told herself this was honest. She told herself honest was better than charming. She had known charming men, had watched her father be charmed by them on multiple occasions at considerable financial cost, and she had developed a settled preference for plain speaking, delivered plainly. She packed 1 trunk and a small leather satchel. In the satchel, she put her mother's Bible, a change of clothes, her teaching certificate rolled carefully in oilcloth, and the small wooden box her father had kept on his desk, the one with the painted lid depicting a meadow in summer, inside which were a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, a lock of her mother's hair tied with a blue ribbon that had faded to almost white, and a folded letter she had never opened because her father had written "not yet" on the envelope in pencil, and somehow she had never found the moment that felt like yet. She left before Edmund Hardcastle's man arrived to take the inventory of the house. She left before the sun came fully up, carrying her trunk to the station in 2 trips because she was not going to ask anyone for help, and she was not going to leave anything of value behind. She bought her ticket with the last of what she had kept separate from everything her father owed in the small envelope at the back of her mother's Bible, where she had put it 2 years ago for a reason she had never been able to articulate, but which now seemed less like caution and more like preparation. She did not say goodbye to anyone who might try to stop her. She sat on the platform bench and waited for the westbound train and watched the town wake up around her. The lamplighter finishing his rounds, the bakery opening its shutters, the ordinary beautiful machinery of a life she was leaving, and she felt something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but occupied the territory between them, the way certain twilights are neither day nor night, but something complete in themselves. Then the train came and she got on it, and Ohio fell away behind her. Nebraska announced itself before she could see it. The land began to flatten somewhere in the middle of Iowa, the soft hills of Ohio giving way to something bigger and less apologetic, something that didn't seem interested in being picturesque. The farms grew farther apart and the spaces between them longer, and then the farms thinned out entirely, and there was simply land, flat, wide, going on past the point where ordinary vision gives up and accepts that it cannot reach the end of what it's looking at. By the time the train crossed into Nebraska, the sky had expanded to a size that felt almost aggressive, too much of it pressing down on too little ground with nothing in between to serve as intermediary. The grass rolled on forever in shades of gold and brown and pale green, and the wind moved through it in long, slow waves that looked from a train window almost like the surface of a lake, if a lake had never heard of staying still. Eliza watched it all with her hands folded in her lap and her expression carefully neutral, the way she had learned to hold her face when she wasn't entirely sure what she was feeling and wasn't ready for anyone to ask. The train pulled into Redstone just after 2 in the afternoon on the 15th of July. Redstone was smaller than she had imagined, which was saying something because she had not imagined it generously. A main street of sun-bleached wooden buildings pressed together with the pragmatic closeness of structures that have learned not to waste space. A livery stable, a general store with a porch where two old men sat in chairs and appeared to have been sitting there since before the war and had achieved a state of stillness indistinguishable from the furniture. A church with a slightly crooked steeple that gave the whole building an air of cheerful imprecision. A bank, a barber, a small hotel that might have been optimistic about the size of the population it expected to serve. The kind of town that had been placed here by necessity rather than ambition and had made its peace long ago with being exactly what it was. She was the only passenger who stepped off. She stood on the platform with her trunk at her feet and her satchel over her shoulder and looked around with the deliberate calm of a woman who had decided somewhere between Ohio and here that she was not going to allow herself to be frightened by what she found. Fear was a luxury she currently could not afford, and she had never been profligate with luxuries even when she could. Then she saw him. He was standing at the far end of the platform, leaning against one of the posts that held up the overhang arms, crossed hat, pulled low against the afternoon sun. He was a big man, not merely tall, but built with the kind of solidity that comes from years of hard physical work, the kind that becomes structural rather than decorative, that changes the way a man stands and moves and takes up space. Dark hair with gray coming in at the temples, though he couldn't have been more than mid-30s. A jaw that looked as if it had been carved from something that did not yield easily. And across his left brow, a scar pale and old, running from the edge of the eyebrow toward the hairline that gave his face a quality she couldn't quite name. Not cruelty, something harder to define. The look of a man who had learned certain things about the world that you cannot learn any way other than the difficult way, and who had not found the experience instructive so much as permanent. He was watching her the way a man watches something he hasn't yet decided what to do with. She picked up her satchel and walked toward him because she was not going to stand on a platform waiting to be approached like a woman who didn't know her own direction. He straightened when she came close, took off his hat. His eyes were dark, the particular dark of deep water that has no obvious bottom, and they gave away nothing at all that she could read, not hostility, not welcome, simply attention. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. "Miss Calloway." His voice was low and flat, like the land outside the train window. Not unkind, just without ornamentation, without the social padding that people in Ohio wrapped around every exchange, as if bare words might cause bruising. He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly too long in the way of a man who was making an assessment and saw no reason to be subtle about it. Then he looked at her trunk. He picked it up without asking, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man performing a task that needed doing, not a man offering a courtesy, and carried it toward a wagon at the edge of the platform. She followed. They did not speak again until they were out of town, moving north along a road that was more suggestion than structure, its surface shaped by the passage of other wagons over years of seasons rather than by any deliberate act of construction. On either side, the grass stretched away to where the earth met the skin. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon and the steady plod of the two horses and the wind moving through everything it touched with the proprietary ease of something that owns the territory. The silence was not hostile. It was simply itself the silence of a man who had learned not to fill time with sound unless the sound meant something. Then Colt Hargrove said, without looking at her, "I need to tell you something." "All right," said Eliza. "I didn't place that advertisement." She turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, a fixed point on the horizon that the road never seemed to reach. "My father placed it. He was ill for a long time before he died, and somewhere in that time he decided." He stopped, pressed his mouth together briefly, then continued. "He made certain decisions on my behalf without informing me. The advertisement was one of them. He died 2 months ago. I found out about the notice when the post office sent me your letter along with 3 others that had come before yours. I didn't respond to the others." The wagon creaked. The grass moved in its slow wave. "So you don't want a wife," Eliza said. "I didn't say that." "You did not say it." Something shifted at the very corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one that had reconsidered before fully arriving. "I don't need one," he said. That's different from not wanting. Eliza looked back at the road ahead. Her hands were folded in her lap and her spine was straight, and her voice when she spoke again was perfectly even. I see. She was quiet for more than a mile after that. She was not falling apart. She was not even close to falling apart. She was thinking with the clear, focused attention that difficult circumstances had always produced in her about what the options actually were. She had come a long way on a gamble, and the gamble had come up short in a specific and important way. The man beside her had not asked for her and did not need her and had made no promises beyond meeting her train, which he had done. She had no money for a return ticket and nowhere to return to in any case. She was 26 years old and she was sitting in a wagon in Nebraska next to a man who didn't want her heading toward a ranch she had never seen, and the closest thing she had to a plan was the one she was currently developing. She looked at the land spreading away in every direction, this enormous, indifferent, sun-scorched land that had no opinion about her situation whatsoever, and she thought about Edmund Hardcastle in the inventory of the house. She thought about the locked drawer and the numbers that couldn't be made better. She thought about the letter in the bottom of her satchel with not yet written in her father's hand, and about a man who had believed enough in some invisible calculus of desperation and probability to copy out an advertisement and hide it where only she would find it. She did not believe in coincidences as a rule. She believed in evidence, and the evidence considered without sentiment suggested that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, even if the exact nature of the destination was still working itself out. The Hargrove Ranch appeared on the horizon the way modest things do, without announcement, without grandeur, simply becoming visible as you got close enough to see it. It was 40 acres, she would learn this later, though it read as more because the land around it declined to acknowledge boundaries. The house was small and weather-worn, the wood gone gray in the way of structures that had been through too many seasons without enough attention between them. The barn was larger than the house and in clearly better repair, which told her something immediate and useful about the man who owned both of them. The fence lines on the east and north sides were partially down. The kitchen garden had gone to weeds and determined wild grasses. The porch steps were loose in a way that would eventually require someone's ankle or someone's attention, and only one of those was free. The whole property had the look of a place that had been struggling for long enough that it had stopped expecting otherwise. Colt brought the wagon around back and unhitched the horses with the fluid efficiency of someone for whom the task was entirely automatic. No wasted motion, no hesitation, the body doing what it knew while the mind was elsewhere. Eliza climbed down without waiting for assistance and stood in the yard and looked at the house and the barn and the fence lines and the kitchen garden, and she made herself see it as it was, rather than as she might wish it, not softened by hope or distorted by despair, but clear. It was hard. The soil was stubborn, the structures were in need, and there was more work here than one person could reasonably manage. But it was workable. She had been a school teacher for 4 years. She understood the relationship between sustained effort and eventual competence. She understood that most things that looked impossible on first inspection had a logic to them that revealed itself to someone patient enough to look for it. That evening, after a supper that she cooked from the sparse contents of the kitchen, 2 plates of salt pork and cornbread, and a pot of coffee strong enough to have opinions about itself, they sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, and Colt told her he would sleep in the barn. "I won't trouble you," he said. He said it the way he said most things, with the directness of a legal declaration and the same absence of apology. "All right," said Eliza. She was quiet while she cleared the plates and washed them in the basin. Then she said without turning from the work, "The fence on the east side is down in 3 places. The roof over the back bedroom leaks. I could see the water staining on the ceiling from here. The kitchen garden will need clearing before it can be planted. And the porch steps are going to break someone's leg by November if they're not looked at." He was watching her from the table. "I've been busy," he said. "I'm not criticizing," she said. "I'm making an inventory." She turned and met his eyes directly. "I'm good at useful things, Mr. Hargrove. I would like to be useful here if you'll allow it." He looked at her for a long moment with the unreadable expression she was beginning to recognize as his default mode. Not closed exactly, but not open either. Something deliberately held at a middle distance. "Get some sleep," he said finally, and went out. She lay awake for a considerable time in the small bedroom at the back of the house, the one that smelled of cedar and old lavender. and something else she could not identify, but that felt in the particular way that certain rooms do, like absence, like the negative space where something or someone used to be. The bed was narrow and the mattress uneven, and through the single window she could see a band of sky so thick with stars that it looked like an overstatement, like something a painter might have been talked out of as implausible. She was thinking about the numbers, the debt, the 30 days, because she had heard it. She had not meant to. She had been coming back from the outhouse in the early dark, moving quietly across the yard, when she had heard voices through the open window of the front room. Colt's low, flat voice and another she did not recognize, sharper and more satisfied with itself, the voice of a man accustomed to having his statements received rather than questioned. She had stood in the shadow of the house and listened without deciding to. Silas Greer, the man from the Redstone Bank, had ridden out that evening while she was settling. He was brief and unambiguous. The Hargrove Ranch carried a debt of $300 due in full within 30 days from the date of the notice, which he had previously delivered and which he trusted Mr. Hargrove had not forgotten. The note was not extendable. There were parties interested in the property if the current owner found himself unable to satisfy his obligations. Mr. Greer would naturally prefer to avoid the courts, which were slow and expensive for everyone concerned. She had heard Colt's silence on the other side of that speech, and she had understood it the way you understand certain silences, not as absence, but as a man holding himself very still so he didn't do something he couldn't undo. When Greer had finally ridden off into the dark, she had heard Colt sit down heavily in a chair, and then nothing more. She had gone back to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. $300, 30 days. She thought for a long time. She thought about her father and the advertisement tucked under the receipts not misplaced left, and about the specific kind of intelligence required to believe from a sickbed in Ohio that a desperate daughter and a struggling rancher in Nebraska might be exactly what the other needed. She didn't know if he had known about the debt. She didn't know if it mattered. What mattered was that she was here, that this land was about to be taken from a man who had already been taken from in other ways she was only beginning to understand, and that she had two hands and a fast mind and nothing left to lose. When she finally closed her eyes, she had made her decision. She was up before the sun the next morning. She had the coffee on and cornbread in the cast-iron skillet before the sky outside the kitchen window had turned from black to the deep purple-gray of earliest morning. She heard Colt come in from the barn, the measured scrape of boots on the porch steps, the careful way he opened the door, the particular quiet of a man who had been alone long enough to stop anticipating that anyone would be inside. He stopped when he saw the coffee and the cornbread and the two plates set out on the table. He looked at them, then at her, then back at them. "Sit down, Mr. Hargrove," she said. "I need to talk to you about something." He sat, she poured the coffee and sat across from him and looked at him directly the way she had learned to look at difficult things steadily, without performance, with the specific quality of attention that sees what is actually there rather than what would be easier to see. "I heard your conversation with Mr. Greer last evening," she said. "I was in the yard. I wasn't attempting to eavesdrop. I'm sorry for the circumstance, but I'm not sorry I know." His jaw tightened. He said nothing. $300 in 30 days, she said. "That's not your concern." "I think it is." She set down her cup. "I came here because I had no good options in Ohio, and I needed a path forward. You didn't ask for a wife, and you don't want the obligation of one. I understand that clearly. But I'm here, and the situation is what it is, and I'd like to propose something." She held his gaze. "I know you have money saved. Not a great deal, but enough. You have the means to pay off that note. What you don't have is enough hands to run this property and make it profitable before next season. Not alone. And you're offering to be those hands." "I'm offering to be your wife," she said, "a real one in the legal sense. We marry before the bank comes back. You use your savings to pay off the note and clear the debt entirely. I stay and work this land beside you, not as a servant, as a partner doing what I'm capable of learning. What grows between us from that or doesn't is something neither of us can decide at a kitchen table before sunrise. But the practical arrangement is clear, and it serves us both." The silence stretched long enough that a rooster somewhere on the property made his first opinion known, and then thought better of it. "You don't know anything about ranching," he said. "I know that I'm a fast learner, and I don't quit when things are hard. This land is harder than anything you've done. That may be true, but I have done hard things my entire life, Mr. Hargrove. I simply haven't been doing them outside. She did not look away. You need someone. I need somewhere. Those two facts don't require sentiment to make them useful to each other. He looked down at his coffee cup. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands, large scarred hands, the hands of a man who had worked in difficult conditions for difficult years and still had all his fingers, which said something about his attentiveness to whatever task was in front of him. Then he looked back at her. I sleep in the barn, he said. That doesn't change. That's fine. I'm not a man who talks much. I noticed. I've got a past that isn't clean, he said. The words came out flat and factual like a weather report. You should know that before you decide. So do I, said Eliza. Most people's pasts aren't clean if you look at them honestly. I don't intend to ask about yours unless you want to tell me, and I'd appreciate the same courtesy. Something moved in his expression. Something that had not been there a moment before and did not entirely announce itself, but was present in the slight adjustment around his eyes, the fractional easing of the set of his shoulders. All right, said Colt Hargrove. 2 words, but the decision in them was complete. They married on a Thursday morning at the Redstone Courthouse in a room that smelled of old paper and lamp oil and served as courthouse town clerk's office, an occasional overflow for the dry goods merchant next door. Judge Aldous Pemberton performed the ceremony with the economy of a man who had married many people under many different circumstances and had concluded over the years that the ritual itself carried the weight, not the words around them. The witnesses were the judge's clerk, a young man named Curtis, who was clearly working hard at not appearing curious and failing at intervals, and Winifred Holt, the Hargroves' nearest neighbor, who lived 4 miles east and had apparently heard about the proceedings through the particular channels of small-town information that required no formal announcement. She had arrived at the courthouse looking like she had ridden directly from her breakfast table, which she had, and she was not going to let that stop her from being present for something she had decided mattered. Winifred was 60 years old and had the posture of a woman who had decided sometime in her 40s that she was finished apologizing for the space she occupied. She had a handshake like a working man and eyes that went straight to what they were looking at without detour. Before the ceremony, she pulled Eliza aside and looked at her for a long moment with the unsentimental attention of a woman taking a genuine reading. You know what you're doing, she asked. I know what the alternative is, Eliza said. Winifred considered this. Good enough, she said, and then more quietly, he's a good man. He doesn't know that about himself yet, but he is. Colt stood beside Eliza in his good shirt pressed and clean, wearing the expression of a man performing a formal duty with full seriousness and no pretense that it was anything other than what it was. He said the words the judge asked for in the same flat voice he used for everything with the same absence of decoration. When Judge Pemberton arrived at the part that concluded things, Eliza kept her eyes on the judge and her hands still at her sides, and told herself with considerable firmness that this was a practical arrangement between 2 adults who needed what the other could provide, and that the formality of the ceremony changed nothing about the practical nature of the thing. Then Colt turned toward her, and some reflex older than reason or practicality made her meet his eyes. He was looking at her with an expression she would spend a significant amount of time trying to understand later. It was not tender in the obvious way. It was not detached either. It was the look of a man who had encountered something he had not accounted for in his planning and was not yet sure what to do about it, something that was not in the ledger. He held out his hand. She put hers in it. His grip was careful. That was the word for it, careful. The grip of a man who was acutely conscious of how much force he was capable of and had made a deliberate ongoing decision about it. Mrs. Hargrove, he said. Mr. Hargrove, she replied. They rode back to the ranch in the wagon side by side in the kind of silence that sits between 2 people who are still taking the measure of what they have just done. The Nebraska sky was blue overhead and enormous. The grass ran away in every direction toward horizons that offered no information about what lay beyond them. The wind moved through everything with its characteristic indifference to human arrangements. The first week settled into a shape that was neither easy nor impossible. Colt kept his word about the barn rising before dawn to work through the days with the focused economy of a man for whom work was not an activity, but a condition, something he was simply in the way. Water is in motion without deciding to be. He fixed the east fence and the porch steps and the roof over the back bedroom, in that order, working through each problem methodically and then moving to the next without comment. Things that were broken became less broken. That was his entire report on the proceedings. Eliza worked alongside. She cleared the kitchen garden of its summer's accumulation of weeds, learning, as she went, which plants were useful and which were aggressive guests, taking her cues from the seed packets she found in the barn and the information Winifred provided on Tuesday mornings when she came by with various claimed excesses from her own stores. She learned to patch the gaps in the inside walls where the autumn cold was already beginning to make its presence known. She cooked 3 meals a day, reliable and plain, not fancy but hot and sufficient, the kind of cooking that treats nourishment as a serious undertaking. She made mistakes. Every new skill had a learning curve that expressed itself in minor disasters and occasional significant ones. She did not make the same mistake twice, which was the standard she held herself to and which she had always found adequate given time. They were not unfriendly. They occupied the same house and the same working days with a deliberate mutual care, each one aware of the other's presence, in the specific way of people who have agreed on something important without discussing it at length, and who are now engaged in the practical work of living up to it. One evening she opened the wrong cabinet looking for a pot and found instead a daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame. A young woman, dark-haired, with the slightly formal posture of someone who had been asked to hold still and taken the instructions seriously. Her expression was composed and direct, and there was something in the set of her eyes that suggested she was capable of being amused by things without necessarily showing it. On the back, in faded pencil, Sarah, June 1867. Eliza looked at it for a moment. Then she put it back exactly as she had found it and closed the cabinet. She asked Winifred about it on the following Tuesday. When Winifred came by with a jar of preserved plums she claimed she had made too many of, which Eliza received as the social fiction it was intended to be and accepted with appropriate gratitude. Sarah Hargrove, Winifred said. She said the name with the particular careful gentleness people use for things that have earned that treatment. Married Colt in '67, just after he came home from the war. She was 22, he was 27. By all accounts, they suited each other. She had patience and he had steadiness. And those two things together can make a life. She paused, looking at her coffee. She died the following year in childbirth. The baby was a boy. Didn't draw a proper breath. Colt was 3 weeks out on a scouting mission in Wyoming when it happened. Word reached him when he was already 2 weeks gone. He rode hard, but he didn't make it back in time. The kitchen was very quiet. He packed everything that had been hers into the back bedroom, Winifred continued, and he didn't go into that room for 2 full years. Then he did, and he took out the photograph and he put it in the cabinet, and that was as far as he got. She looked at Eliza with the direct eyes that went straight to what they were examining. He's not a man who stops caring about things just because caring got expensive. He's not built that way. Eliza looked out the kitchen window at the barn where the lantern was still burning in the late afternoon light. I recognize the type, she said, and meant it. She went back to her work, and in the morning, without discussing it with anyone, she left a cup of coffee outside the barn door at 5 o'clock before the sun was up. She heard him come out and find it. She did not look up from the stove. In the 3rd week, she noticed the change. She had come in from the kitchen garden in the late afternoon to find a small cluster of wildflowers sitting on the corner of the kitchen table. Prairie asters, mostly with a few late-blooming goldenrod that had gone slightly tired at the edges. They had not been there an hour before. There was no note and no comment forthcoming from the man sitting at the far end of the table examining his coffee cup with unnecessary attentiveness. Eliza found an old jar, filled it with water, placed the flowers in it, and set it on the windowsill, where the morning light would find them. She did not say anything about it, but when she turned around, there was something different about the quality of the silence in the room. Not warmer exactly, but less insulated, as if one layer of the careful distance had been quietly removed. "Good night, Mr. Hargrove," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Hargrove," he said. She went to bed thinking about her father and the advertisement tucked under the receipts, and about the specific faith required to believe from a distance and in the dark that two people you had never seen together might be what the other needed. She could not decide if what she felt toward that faith was gratitude or bewilderment. She settled eventually on both and found the combination strangely steadying. The following morning, she put his coffee outside the barn door at 5, same as she had for 2 weeks, and when she looked up from the porch, she saw him standing at the edge of the yard watching the sunrise. He was still in that way he had of being still not passive, not absent, but fully present in the moment, without requiring the moment to be anything other than what it was. He turned as if he felt her looking. Neither of them said anything. He went to the barn and she went inside and began breakfast, and the ordinary day assembled itself around them, the way ordinary days do, task by task, hour by hour, unremarkable and necessary. She was at the stove when she heard it. Hoofbeats. A single rider moving at a pace that was purposeful rather than urgent, the pace of someone with a destination and no particular reason to hurry beyond the business of arrival. She went to the window. The rider had a government horse. She could tell by the build and the equipment the precise way the animal moved. The man in the saddle had the straight-backed ease of someone who had spent years in federal service, unhurried, watchful, occupying his space with the practiced economy of a man who had never needed to perform authority because he simply had it. On the front of his dark coat, catching the morning light as he turned his horse up the lane, a badge. United States Marshal. Eliza stood at the window with the skillet in her hand and watched him come up the lane toward the Hargrove property and felt the first cold thread of something that was not fear, but lived in very close proximity to it. Behind her, the kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and cornbread. Outside, the rider reined in his horse. He looked toward the barn. Marshal Renwick did not dismount right away. He sat his horse at the edge of the yard with the patience of a man who had spent a career arriving at places where his arrival was not welcome and had developed a professional equanimity about it. He read the property the way men in his line of work read everything, not decoratively, but functionally, cataloging the exits, the sight lines, the physical evidence of how things stood. His eyes moved across the barn and the new fence and the kitchen garden that had been cleared and turned since someone with purpose had taken it in hand. They moved across the house. Then they settled on Colt, who had come out of the barn and was standing in the yard with his arms at his sides and his weight balanced with the specific quality of a man who is not going to move first. Neither spoke. The morning light came in low and flat, the quality of late August, when the summer has spent most of its energy and is coasting on reserves. The grass beyond the fence made its characteristic sound, that dry whispering that the wind produces when it moves through cured grass, a sound that suggests age and patience and the long indifference of the land to whatever is happening on its surface. Then Renwick dismounted. He was lean and weathered, with a face that had been shaped by outdoor years into something both hard and seasonable, the face of a man who had seen most human behavior and retained the capacity to distinguish between varieties of it. He walked toward Colt with an even stride and stopped at the distance of a man who respected physical reality. "Colt Hargrove," he said. "Marshal." Colt's hands were visible and still. "Thomas Renwick, U.S. Marshal Service." He produced a folded document from inside his coat and held it out. "I need you to read that." Eliza had come onto the porch. She did not announce herself. She stood and watched the two men in the yard, and from where she stood, she could see the particular stillness that moved through Colt when he unfolded the document, the stillness of a man receiving news that he had perhaps known was coming and had hoped, in the ordinary way of people who hope against the probable, would not arrive quite yet. He read it through once completely. Then he looked up at Renwick. "How long has it been open?" he asked. 8 months, Renwick said. "The family of a Private Elias Corwin filed a formal petition last January. Corwin was one of 4 men killed at the Stillwater crossing in November of '68. He paused, then continued in the careful tone of a man who has made a practice of distinguishing between fact and judgment. "You were the ranking officer on that mission." "I was," Colt said. "The Army closed the file in '69. Determined the circumstances were consistent with battlefield conditions and the exigencies of night operations in hostile territory." Renwick's voice was neutral, the voice of a man who had read official language long enough to hear the distance between it and the unmediated truth. "The Corwin family disputes that determination. They have the right to." Renwick looked at him steadily. "You're not going to tell me it wasn't your fault." "No," said Colt. "I'm not going to tell you that." The hawk that lived in the cottonwood at the north fence made a wide turn overhead and rode a thermal higher, becoming a smaller thing against the blue. "There will be a formal inquiry in Washington," Renwick said. "You'll receive written notice of the date. Your presence is required, not requested. He folded his hands in front of him. I want to be straight with you, Mr. Hargrove. This is an inquiry, not an indictment. I've read the 69 report in the field logs. I understand the conditions that night, the terrain, the timeline, the pressure you were under. He stopped. But I also read the surgeon's affidavit and the statement from Corwin's sergeant. Colt said nothing. There was whiskey, Renwick said. The words sat in the yard between them with the weight of something that had been waiting to be spoken in exactly this context for exactly this long. Yes, said Colt. There was. Renwick nodded once slowly with the manner of a man closing a door he had needed to open. He pocketed the document and took up his horse's reins. The written notice will come within 3 weeks. Don't make me come back with something less courteous than a summons. He put his boot in the stirrup. I'm told you've been sober 2 years. That's right. Good, said Renwick, in the tone of a man for whom that meant something specific and personal, and was not simply a thing to say. Keep it that way. He turned his horse and rode back down the lane at the same even pace he had come by, without looking back at the house. Colt stood in the yard with his hands at his sides until the sound of hoofbeats dissolved into the general quiet of the plains. Then he walked to the fence at the edge of the yard and put both hands on the top rail and stood looking at the horizon with the focused attention of a man studying a problem that exists outside of the visible. Eliza came down from the porch and crossed the yard and stopped beside him. She did not ask what the document said. She did not ask what had happened at the Stillwater crossing on a November night in 1868, or how much whiskey or what order had been given that sent 4 men to a river ford they should not have crossed in darkness. She had heard enough standing on the porch to understand the shape of it, and she understood also that the shape was the kind a man carries for years, not forgetting it, not moving past it, simply integrating it into the architecture of his daily life until it becomes indistinguishable from the structure itself. She reached out and placed her hand on his forearm, just her hand on his arm through the fabric of his sleeve for a moment. Colt went very still. Then by degrees, the rigid set of his shoulders came down a fraction, not relaxing in the ordinary sense, but releasing something, some load-bearing tension that had been in place for a long time and had learned to be there so continuously that it had forgotten it was still holding something up. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the horizon, but he did not move away. August turned difficult in its final week, though not because of the weather. Silas Greer had not returned to the ranch since the morning he had been paid, the morning he had stood in the kitchen with the bank draft in his hands and arranged his expression into something professionally cordial and departed without a word that could be turned against him later. But his absence from the property did not mean his absence from the situation. Greer was a man who preferred to work at a distance, and distance in his hands was a tool. The letter arrived from a Lincoln solicitor in the first week of August, written in the dense and careful language of someone who had been paid to make a simple thing seem complicated. It informed Colt that upon review of the original note Article 7, subsection C, pertaining to administrative fees and late fees accumulated during the period of delinquency, had not been satisfied by the principal payment. The outstanding balance calculated per the bank's accounting was $150. Colt read it at the kitchen table and set it down and looked at the wall. Eliza read it after him. She read it twice the way she read documents that required understanding rather than merely reading, looking for the structure beneath the language, the argument being constructed in the white space. He invented this provision, she said, most likely. It's predatory. The language is circular. It references itself to establish its own validity. Yes. Can it be challenged? Colt was quiet. With a lawyer in Lincoln and more time and money than I currently have. He took the letter back and folded it. He's not after the money. He wants the land. There's an aquifer under the North 40, significant by the Geological Survey from '62. He's known about it for years. I know he knows. He figures if he stacks enough difficulties against me, eventually the arithmetic becomes impossible, and I sell. How much does he think you can absorb before you break? More than I have. Then we need to be more careful than he expects, Eliza Downs said. And we need to document everything. Every incident, every letter, every rider who comes onto this property uninvited. She looked at him steadily. If this goes before a judge eventually, I want something to show him. Something in Colt's expression shifted in the fractional way it shifted when something had reached him that he hadn't been expecting. He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. She went to the kitchen drawer and found the journal she had been keeping since July, notes on the farm, on the work, on what needed doing and what had been done, and she opened it to a fresh page and dated it and wrote down the contents of the letter in full with her own annotation of the specific logical circularity in the provision being invoked. Colt watched her write. He did not say anything about it. But she had come to understand that the absence of objection from a man of his particular economy with words was its own form of agreement. The higher trouble began the following week. It was subtle at first, calibrated to the threshold of plausible coincidence. A section of fence that Colt had repaired twice in 3 weeks came down overnight on the northwest corner. 2 cattle were found a mile south of the property line, having apparently passed through a gap that had not been there the day before. A water trough was fouled in the night, something added to it that turned the water gray and sent the horses to the far end of the paddock, ears back. Colt did not say aloud who he believed was responsible. He did not need to. Eliza wrote it down in the journal anyway. Dates, descriptions, the location of each incident, the physical evidence left behind, and what it suggested about how the damage had been done. They worked harder. Both of them in parallel and in concert, moving through the days with the concentrated purposefulness of people who have identified the shape of a problem and decided not to be defeated by it. Eliza took over the east fence, entirely learning the wire by trial and by the specific education of minor injuries, her hands going from soft to calloused in a way that she found, to her own surprise, something close to satisfying. She checked the water troughs every morning before anything else. She kept her notes. The evenings were changing in the way things change when 2 people have been sharing their days in common difficulty, slowly, imperceptibly, by such small degrees that you could not have pointed to a specific moment and said, here is where it shifted, only that it had. Colt was coming inside earlier. She was leaving the lamp burning a little longer. Some evenings they sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table, she with her journal, and he with the farm accounts, and the only sound was the scratch of pen on paper and the occasional pop of the fire settling. And the silence had taken on a quality that was less like the silence between strangers and more like the silence between people who have, without formal discussion, arrived at a mutual understanding about certain things. The storm came on a Thursday night in the second week of September. It announced itself in the afternoon, the particular piling up of cloud to the southwest that experienced plains people raid with respect and without sentiment, the kind of sky that doesn't ask whether you're ready. Colt came in from the field at supper, looking at the horizon with the expression of a man who has done the relevant arithmetic and doesn't like the answer. "Secure everything after we eat," he said. "It's going to be significant." It was more than significant. By 9 o'clock, the wind had achieved the specific ferocity of a plain storm at full commitment, not gusting but constant, a solid pressure against every surface, driving the rain in horizontal sheets that struck the windows like fistfuls of gravel. The temperature had dropped with the speed of something that didn't believe in transitions. Lightning moved across the western horizon in slow, deliberate steps, each strike followed by thunder that arrived not as a crack, but as a long, rolling compression you felt in your chest before your ears registered it. The horses lost their composure. Eliza heard it over the general violence of the storm, the sharp panic drumming of hooves against wood, the high, distressed sound that horses make when the ancient survival-oriented part of their brain has overridden everything else. She was pulling on her coat before she had made a conscious decision to moving toward the door with the automatic directness of someone who has committed to a course of action before the fear has had a chance to weigh in on the discussion. "Stay inside," Colt said from somewhere behind her in the dark. She was already through the door. The barn was lit by a single storm lantern swinging on its hook, its light strobing with the door's movement, in the gale throwing wild orange shadows across the stalls and the loose straw and the white-eyed animals moving in distressed circles. 2 horses had gotten free of their stalls, the big bay gelding, who was Colt's primary working horse, and had the panicked intensity of a large animal that has fully committed to its own worst instincts, and the roan mare with the white blaze, who had been Eliza's particular project for the past 6 weeks, and who was currently expressing her anxiety in the direction of the south wall. Colt got to the bay. Eliza went to the roan. She had not done this in a storm. She had not done most of what she had learned to do in the past 8 weeks. But she knew this horse's specific language now, the ear positions, the breathing, The particular way she carried her head when genuine fear had taken over, versus when she was simply being theatrical. Eliza moved in close and found the spot just below the crest of the mane that she had discovered in the third week, the pressure point that seemed to reach something in the animal that lived below the panic, and she applied steady, deliberate pressure and talked low and continuous and without urgency, using the tone her father had used when she was small and frightened, which was the only model she had and which seemed to translate across species without difficulty. The roan's breathing slowed by degrees. On the other side of the barn, the bay was not having it. He went up on his hind legs as Colt reached for the halter, all 16 hands of him. And when he came down wrong, or Colt moved wrong, and she heard the impact from across the barn, the solid, conclusive sound of something connecting with a human being, with the full weight of the encounter behind it. And then Colt was against the wall of the stall with his left arm pulled against his body and his face doing the thing it did when he was in pain and was not going to show it in any way he could prevent. Colt, I'm fine. He pushed off the wall. His voice had the quality of a declarative statement that is intended to close a subject. Your ribs. One maybe, it's not serious. He went after the bay again with the steady patience of a man who has decided something is going to happen and is simply committed to waiting for the moment. It took 20 more minutes. When both horses were settled and secured and the barn doors latched against the full force of what was outside and the lantern trimmed and properly hung, Eliza and Colt stood in the center aisle of the barn in the relative quiet. Relative only because the storm was still working itself out against the roof above them, which was making its structural opinion known at some volume. They were both soaked through to the degree that distinguishes thoroughness from mere dampness. Colt had his left arm against his body in a way that was too deliberate to be casual. Let me look at the ribs, she said. I know it's not serious, she said evenly. Let me look anyway. He did not argue further. He stood still while she pressed carefully along the left side of his rib cage, with the specific attention she brought to any task that required getting the information right the first time, and determined that he had at minimum 2 ribs that were going to make their presence known for several weeks, but nothing that suggested structural emergency. You need to be more careful, she said. You need to have stayed inside, he said, not angrily, with the rough edge of something that was not anger but was adjacent to it, the way concern expresses itself in people who are not accustomed to having anyone to be concerned about. I wasn't going to stay inside, she said. I know that. The roughness was different now. That's not... He stopped, looked at the middle distance between them, at the swinging lantern, at nothing specific. Then he looked at her, and something in his face had gotten past the wall. He kept most things behind, not falling through it, but moving past it. The what a large thing sometimes moves past a barrier. It is too big to be stopped by. When I heard you come in after me, he said, when I looked up and saw you in here with those horses. Colt, I've lost people. The words came up from somewhere that had depth to it. I know what it is to turn around and find the space where someone was. I know the weight of that, the specific weight. He looked at her directly. I don't have the right to tell you what to do or how to behave, and I know that. But when I saw you in here, something happened that I don't have an adequate word for, and I needed you to know it happened. The rain on the roof, the horses breathing settling into themselves. Eliza stepped forward. She put her arms around him, careful of the ribs, feeling the tension in him, the particular held quality of a man who has been keeping himself at a controlled remove from everything for long enough that it has become his default condition. He was rigid against her for a moment, like wood, like a door that has been closed so long it has forgotten how to open. Then by degrees he was not. His arm came around her shoulders with a careful precision that was itself a form of tenderness, the care of a man who knows how much force he has and has made a conscious, deliberate choice about it. His head came down over hers. She could feel the uneven quality of his breathing, the way it caught and then was controlled and then caught again. You scared me, he said into her hair. The words were barely louder than the rain. I know, she said. They stood like that until the storm committed fully and then began to spend itself. Greer moved in the last week of September, and this time he moved without the cover of legal instruments or the fiction of plausible coincidence. The two men he had been using through August, a pair, known in Redstone as Decker and Vance, who were available for the kind of work that required cash payment and the asking of no questions, came to the Hargrove property on a Friday night when the moon was down and the wind from the north covered most sounds that ordinarily carried. They brought a glass bottle with a rag and a purpose. The barn's south wall, where the summer had left the wood as dry as old paper, where the lamp oil was stored in the tack room, where loose straw lay in accumulated drifts below the beams, it was ready for a spark in the way that things are ready when a long, dry summer has done its preparation work. Eliza woke to the smell. She was out of bed and across the room before she was fully conscious, driven by the oldest alarm in the human system, the one that doesn't wait for the reasoning mind to catch up. Through the window, the glow from the barn was already the color and character of active fire, the moving, breathing orange of something that has found its purpose. She ran. The barn door was hot under her hands when she pulled it open, and the smoke hit her at once, the dense, low-moving kind that negotiates nothing with your eyes or your lungs. She pulled her nightgown collar up over her nose and moved into the dark and the smoke because the small bay foal she had been bottle feeding for 3 weeks, the one with the crumpled ear and the habit of pressing his face into her shoulder, when she came into his stall was in the last stall on the left, and she had not consulted him about whether tonight was acceptable. She found him by sound down on the stall floor, scrambling and terrified, and she got her arms under his neck the way she had learned to hold him and spoke to him in the tone that reached past the fear, and felt him respond, felt the frantic movement slow into something that could be directed. And then Colt's voice arrived behind her in the smoke, not loud, not panicked, simply completely present. "I've got you both," he said. He was there in the dark, and his hands found the foal, and then found her, and he moved them together toward the door, and the night air met them all at once, cold and clean and abundant, and they went down onto the grass in the yard, with the foal between them and the barn behind them, speaking in the full voice of something that has found its commitment. Colt set the foal gently on the grass. Then he looked at his right hand. He had grabbed the door frame as he came through, pulling it wide to clear the foal, and the wood had been burning along the top edge. The burn ran across his palm and down to the base of his fingers, red-white, in the firelight blistering already the kind of injury that announces its intention to make itself known for a considerable time. Eliza took his hand in both of hers. She said nothing. She simply held it, looking at what had been done to it, and something moved through her that was too large and too compound to be named simply. It was not guilt, though guilt was in it. It was not grief, though grief was in it too. It was the specific, overwhelming compound of a person who has understood very suddenly and very clearly that someone else's pain matters to them in a way that has moved beyond the practical. She was crying before she knew it, not the performative kind, not the kind that announces itself, but the quiet kind that happens when the body decides on its own that it has been holding more than it was designed to hold and has chosen this moment to begin addressing that. The fire made its orange light across everything. Colt watched her face. Then he reached up with his unburned hand and touched her cheek, his thumb moving along the line of her face slowly and deliberately, with the quality of a man who is doing something he has thought about and decided on rather than something that simply happened. Eliza turned toward him, and Colt Hargrove, who had not allowed himself to want anything in 7 years, because wanting had proven itself to be the most efficient route to unbearable loss, lowered his head and kissed his wife. It was not a practiced kiss or a polished one. It was the kind that happens when two people have been circling a truth for long enough that the circling finally stops, not with ceremony or announcement, but with simple arrival. The relief of a door opening that has been closed a long time. Careful for one breath and then not careful in the sense of withholding, though still careful in the sense of him. His unburned hand still held her face with that particular attention. When they separated, the fire above them had found its full height and was conducting itself accordingly. Neither of them said anything for a while. The silence was not uncomfortable. October in Nebraska has a quality of resolution. The heat breaks completely, the light goes amber and low and long across the land, and everything that has been hazy or indeterminate through the summer months sharpens into clarity, as if the season has been given the last piece it needed to make sense. Colt gathered his evidence in this October with the same methodical patience he brought to every task that mattered. He had been building it quietly since August, a written record of each incident with dates and descriptions and physical measurements. The chemical analysis of the fouled water that a chemist in Lincoln had agreed to perform and document for a fee. The statements from two neighboring ranchers who had seen Decker and Vance on the road near the Hargrove property multiple times, and a letter from the Redstone hardware merchant confirming that a quantity of lamp oil had been purchased by a man matching Vance's description on the afternoon of the fire. He laid it on the county sheriff's desk on a Tuesday morning and stood back while Sheriff Hauser, a careful, literal man who had survived 3 terms in office by being thorough, read through all of it twice. "This is sufficient for Decker and Vance," Hauser said. "And Greer, getting from those two to him requires one of them to make a calculation about their own self-interest." Hauser looked at Colt over the papers. "In my experience, that calculation tends to get made once they have had a few days to consider the alternative." Decker and Vance were in custody by the end of the week. By Saturday, Vance had made precisely the calculation Hauser had predicted. Silas Greer spent a Friday afternoon in a small room at the county building, answering questions from the sheriff with the look of a man who has realized too late that he has miscalculated the durability of the people he was attempting to wear down. He was not charged that day. The law moved at its own pace as it always had. But that evening, Eliza wrote in her journal, "Greer's hold on this property ended today. He does not yet know it. He will." Marshal Renwick returned to the ranch on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the fire this time, with the formal notice printed government stationery of the kind that exists to communicate that certain things are not matters of preference. The inquiry date was set, Washington, D.C., late January. Colt would need to depart in November to arrive in time by rail. 3 months. Gone. He came to find Eliza in the kitchen garden where she was turning the beds over in preparation for winter, working the soil with a fork and the attention of someone who has developed a genuine relationship with a piece of ground through the work invested in it. She looked up at his face. "When do you leave?" she asked. "November," he said. "If I go." She straightened up and looked at him directly. "You're going." "Eliza, you're going," she said again, and her voice was not hard, but it was definite, the voice of a woman who has thought the question through. "You have spent 7 years carrying what happened at that crossing. You have a chance now to stand in front of those families and say in person what happened, not through a clerk or a letter, but standing there yourself, letting them see that you understand what you cost them." She held his gaze. "That's not something a man of your particular construction can walk away from and live with himself." He was looking at her in the way he looked at her when he was seeing her clearly and was not entirely certain what to do about what he saw. "The ranch," he began. "I'll manage the ranch. It's a Nebraska winter." "Colt." She took one step toward him and put her hand flat against his chest, feeling the heartbeat beneath it. "I am not the woman who got off the train in July. That woman had never worked wire in her life. I know this land now. I know these animals. I know how to manage what needs managing." She let that sit between them. "I will be here when you come back." That is not a question or a hope. It is a statement of what is going to happen. He looked down at her hand on his chest. Then he reached up and covered it with his own. "I love you," he said. The words came out with the quality of something that has been behind a door for a long time and has finally found it unlatched, not a speech, not a declaration dressed up in borrowed language, just 3 words from a man who had learned to mean exactly what he said, and nothing more and nothing less. Eliza felt them arrive with the full weight they carried. She moved his hands slowly, deliberately from her chest to her abdomen. She pressed his palm against her and held it there and looked at him. Colt looked down at his hand, then up at her face. The adjustment that moved through him was the kind that requires the whole person, the stillness, the long breath, the recalibration of something that had been set to one expectation and was now receiving another. Then something moved across his face that lived past surprise and past joy and was older than either. His hand opened against her, careful, present. "Eliza," he said. She put her free hand on the side of his face. "Go to Washington," she said quietly. "Do what needs to be done. Come home to us." The October light came in long and amber across the Hargrove fields, and the grass moved in its familiar, slow wave, and the sky above them was the clear, deep blue that this particular country produces when summer is completely gone, and something more honest takes its place. The morning Colt left Nebraska was doing what it does in November. The cold had arrived in the night without negotiation, not the crisp, walkable cold of October, but the settled, committed cold of a plains winter that has made its decision and intends to be thorough about it. The sky was the color of unpolished pewter hosen, and opinionated, pressing down on the land with the impartiality of something that makes no distinctions between the deserving and the otherwise. Colt was up 2 hours before the sun. Eliza heard him moving through the house with the particular quiet of a man attempting not to disturb someone, which meant he had either forgotten or was choosing to overlook the fact that she had not slept past 4 in the morning since mid-October, when the baby had discovered the pre-dawn hours and developed an enthusiasm for them that showed no signs of diminishing. She was in the kitchen when he came through, dressed for the road, his coat buttoned and his hat in his hand and the leather saddlebag over his shoulder. He stopped when he saw her. "You should be resting," he said. "You should stop being surprised that I'm not." She turned from the stove and handed him a cup of coffee and looked at him. This man she had married out of desperation and calculation and some invisible force she still did not have an entirely satisfying name for, and felt the full particular weight of what the past 4 months had built between them. She had not expected this. She had expected competence and practicality and the modest dignities of a well-managed arrangement. She had not expected this specific, stubborn, irreplaceable thing. He drank the coffee, standing the way he drank everything when time was the constraint. She had made biscuits. She wrapped them in a cloth and tucked them into the saddlebag, moving his papers to make room with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who has made the decision and is not going to discuss it. He watched her do it and did not object. When the bag was buckled and the cup was set aside and the kitchen had done everything it could for them, they stood facing each other in the lamplight, and the moment had the quality of things that want more time than they are going to receive. Colt reached into his coat. He brought out 2 objects and held them toward her. The first was a small iron key on a cord of braided leather piece, the key to the strongbox under the bedroom floorboard, where the remaining cash reserve and the property deed were kept. She had known the strongbox existed. He had never offered her the key before. The second was a folding knife with a bone handle worn smooth on one side from years of being carried in a particular hand, in a particular way, short-bladed, well-maintained, made for use. "Strongbox first," he said. "If Greer moves anything new while the county case is still moving, there's enough to cover 2 months. Winifred knows where the deed is if you need it for any legal purpose. All right." The knife. He turned it in his hand once, then held it out. "I've had it since '63. It's been through a number of situations I don't talk about in company and come back from most of them intact." He paused. "I want you to have it while I'm gone, not because I think you need it specifically." "Then why?" He looked at her directly. "Because it's the most reliable thing I own, and I want it near you." Eliza took the knife. She felt the weight of it, the worn history of the handle, the evidence of years of use and care and the quality of its maintenance. She closed her fingers around it. "Come back to us," she said. He stepped forward and held her with the careful, total attention he always brought to holding her, the particular consciousness of a large man who is aware of what he is holding and treats that awareness as a matter of ongoing obligation. She felt his chin come to rest against her hair. His exhale was long and slow and went through his whole body. "That's already decided," he said. "That's not a question I'm still working on." She stood on the porch with the knife in her hand and watched him ride north along the lane toward the road that would take him to the rail station at Kearney, and she watched until the darkness had absorbed him entirely, and then there was nothing remaining but the cold and the wind and the enormous, unconcerned darkness of the plains in the pre-dawn hours of a November morning. She went inside. She put the knife on the kitchen table where she could see it while she worked. She started breakfast. November on the Hargrove Ranch without Cole Hargrove was not the defeat of loneliness. It was something more specific and more interesting than that. It was the daily education in the exact weight of a particular absence, not the general absence of company, but the precise absence of this person felt at specific moments and in specific locations. The cold side of the bed, the single cup on the table, the barn work that took her an hour and a half when he had done it in 40 minutes. Not because she was incapable, but because she was still learning the sequence, the internal logic of tasks that he performed with the automatic efficiency of 20 years of repetition. She learned the sequence. By the third week, the barn work took 50 minutes. She was up before dawn every morning, and she worked until after dark, and she fell asleep with the clean exhaustion of someone who has given the day everything it asked and kept nothing back for regret. The baby continued its steady project of becoming, not painfully but insistently, with the particular authority of something that has its own timeline and would appreciate your acknowledgement. Winifred Holt came every Tuesday without exception and without announcement and with varying claimed reasons that all meant the same thing. She was checking in, and she was not going to be subtle about considering it her business to do so. She came with preserves and bread and once a fully cooked ham of implausible size that she attributed to poor planning, and that Eliza accepted with the straightforward gratitude of a woman who understood that certain gifts are primarily expressions of the giver and that the right response is to receive them gracefully. "You're managing well," Winifred said on the third Tuesday of November, making her assessment of the kitchen and the yard with the practical eyes of a woman who had run her own ranch through 2 droughts and a husband's broken leg. "I'm managing adequately," Eliza said. "Out here, those are the same thing." The Alderman family to the south appeared one morning without announcement and fixed the problematic section of the south fence before Eliza could discuss terms. The Fitch family sent their eldest son twice a week to help with the heavy barn work. Eliza received all of it with straightforward gratitude and noted every instance in her journal because she intended to return every favor in kind and at full value when the spring came and her circumstances permitted it, and she was not a woman who forgot her accounts. Greer remained quiet. The county investigation had entered its deliberate phase, the phase of letters between lawyers and documents reviewed by officials in Lincoln who were not being paid for urgency. The harassment had stopped entirely. Decker and Vance were in the county jail, and whatever instructions Greer might have wished to transmit to other interested parties, the attention of the law was sufficient disincentive for the present. This suited Eliza well. She had enough to manage. The first letter from Colt arrived in the last week of November. She read it at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close and the wind working at the door gaps she had been meaning to address for 2 weeks. His handwriting was plain and functional letters built for the clear communication of information, rather than for any aesthetic effect. Sentences constructed the way he constructed everything with the minimum number of elements required to do the job completely. He had arrived safely. The rail journey had been extended by track difficulties outside Chicago. He was at a boarding house 2 blocks from the War Department. The inquiry had been postponed 11 days due to the illness of one of the panel officers. Not serious, just inconvenient, which appears to be the federal government's primary operational mode. She allowed herself a brief smile at that. The city is large and loud and thoroughly convinced of its own significance. "I don't think it would suit either of us for any length of time. I've been thinking about the North Field and the aquifer. If the county resolves Greer's situation in the direction Hauser expects, that land is ours clean and free by spring. I have ideas about what we might do with the water access that I want to discuss with you when I'm back. It involves more fencing and a considerable amount of work, and I expect you'll have opinions about the most efficient approach because you always do and you are generally right about them. How are you feeling? How is the baby?" Right back. She wrote back that evening, 4 pages, the most she had written to anyone in years. She told him about the fence and the aldermans and the ham. She told him about the foal, the one they had pulled from the burning barn, whom Colt had never named and whom she had quietly begun calling Ember, who had developed the habit of following her through the yard with an air of ownership that was going to require negotiation in the spring. She told him about the baby who was healthy and active and had apparently decided that the hours between 3 and 5 in the morning were the appropriate time to conduct most of its business. She did not tell him about Corfe. She would tell him when he was home. There was nothing useful he could do about it from Washington, and she did not intend to give him something to carry in addition to what he was already carrying. The man named Corfe appeared at the ranch on a gray afternoon in early December. He sat his horse at the edge of the yard with the easy familiarity of someone who has been somewhere before and expects that familiarity to communicate something. He was not visibly armed and not aggressive in any way he couldn't back away from, if pressed. He introduced himself pleasantly, said he was a business associate of Mr. Greer's, said he was simply checking on some outstanding matters. Eliza looked at him. She took his measure and the time it took to register the way he held his reins, the quality of the calculation running behind his pleasant expression, and the specific variety of his smile. The smile of a man who has assessed the situation as one woman visibly pregnant, alone far from town in December, and has concluded that these variables produce a particular kind of leverage. She went back inside the house. She came back out with Colt's rifle carried correctly held at the balance point, the way he had demonstrated 3 separate evenings in September before the circumstances had gotten complicated. She stood on the porch and she looked at Korf with the expression she had been developing since July for situations that required complete clarity. "Mr. Greer is currently the subject of a county investigation," she said, her voice carried easily in the cold air, neither raised nor forced. "Any outstanding matters he has with this property are matters between his legal representation and the county court. I'd appreciate it if you'd communicate that to him." She paused just long enough. "You're not welcome to come back here." Korf's pleasant expression underwent a revision. "Now, Mrs. Hargrove, the man who taught me to handle this rifle," she said, "was an Army scout for 11 years who was particular about technique. She did not raise the rifle. She did not need to. I'd like you to leave now, please." Korf left. She stood on the porch until the sound of his horse had gone entirely, then went back inside and set the rifle against the wall and sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in both hands for exactly the amount of time she had decided was acceptable. Then she picked up her journal and wrote down the date, the time, the man's name, and a complete description, including the horse's markings in the direction of his departure. Then she started supper. December was long in the way of things that commit fully to their own duration. The cold deepened with the conviction of something that had waited all year for its moment. The snow came twice the second time seriously, and Eliza spent 2 days managing the animals with the focused attention of a woman who has decided on principle not to be overwhelmed and has therefore found that she is not. Winifred came on Tuesdays. The Fitch boy came twice a week. She wrote to Colt. His letters came every 10 days, regular and plain and warm, in the way that he was warm in the information itself, in the specificity of what he chose to describe in the right, back at the end of each one that meant more in its brevity than a longer expression would have. The inquiry had been held. He described it in one paragraph that she read 4 times. There were 11 people in the room, 3 officers on the panel and 4 witnesses and the families of 2 of the men. Corwin's mother was there, a small woman, gray-haired, who sat very straight throughout and looked at me directly the entire time. I told him what happened. All of it. Not the version constructed to make the best case for myself, but the accurate version, the whiskey, the decision, the result. I did not ask for understanding. I said what I had done, and I said that I had spent 7 years knowing it and not finding a way to say so to the people who had the most right to hear it. Mrs. Corwin asked me one question when the formal portion concluded. She asked whether I thought about her son. I told her I thought about all 4 of them every Monday and expected to do so for the rest of my life, and that I was sorry, not the legal variety that asked to be absolved, but the other kind, the kind that acknowledges a debt that cannot be paid and commits to carrying it honestly. She looked at me for a long time. Then she nodded. Not forgiveness. Acknowledgement, I think. The recognition of a truth being told plainly. I understand something now that I didn't understand before. It will take more than a letter to explain it. I'll tell you when I'm home. Eliza read that paragraph at the kitchen table and felt something move in her chest, something structural, something at the level of foundation settling into ground that had finally decided it would hold. She wrote back, "Come home. We are waiting for you." He came back on a Thursday in February. She had not known the exact day. He had written to say he was departing Washington in the last week of January, but rail connections were uncertain, and she should expect him sometime in the first 2 weeks of February rather than on any specific date. She had decided to approach this practically and not permit herself to look at the southern road from the yard every time she was outside. She was not entirely successful at this. On the Thursday, she was in the barn with the afternoon feeding, measuring out the grain with the attentiveness to quantities that she had developed from Colt's careful records, when she heard a horse on the road outside, one horse moving at the easy pace of an animal, and rider who are both tired and know they are nearly done with a long thing and have stopped pretending otherwise. She set down the feed bucket. She walked to the barn door and stood in it and looked out at the lane. He came through the gate on the gray horse, moving at a walk head down against the February cold, and She watched the moment he looked up and saw the house, the lamplight in the kitchen window, the smoke from the chimney, the yard that had been kept and maintained through 3 months of a Nebraska winter and was still unmistakably a working property rather than a surrendered one. He saw her in the barn doorway. He stopped the horse. For a moment, neither of them moved in the way of people who have been holding something carefully in their minds for a long time and find it suddenly actually present in front of them and require a moment to make the full adjustment from the idea of a thing to the thing itself. Then he dismounted, he came across the yard, and he was the same man, the same width of shoulder, the same quality of movement, the scar above his eye, the dark hat, and also he was different in a way she would spend time finding the right words for later. Something in the way he held himself. Some quality of a person who has been slightly out of true for a long time and has been returned to plumb. The weight was still there, she could see that, and she had not expected it to be gone, but it was carried differently, honestly rather than secretly. She walked out to meet him. He put his arms around her in the yard, and she felt the exhale that went through his entire body, the physical release of something that a person does not know they are holding until the moment they set it down. His arms were careful with her, always careful, and his face came down into her hair, and he stood there without speaking for a long moment in the February cold. "You're here," he said, less an observation than something he needed to say out loud and hear. "I told you I would be," she said. His arms tightened slightly. "The baby is fine. We are both entirely fine." She pulled back enough to see his face. He looked thinner. He looked like a man who had done something difficult and necessary and had come back from it changed in the way that necessary, difficult things change. People not diminished, but different. Something clarified that had previously been obscure. The quality she had always felt in him, that she had never had a precise name for, the watchful, braced quality of a man waiting for something to catch up with him, was gone. What was there in its place was simpler and older and more at rest. "Come inside," she said. "I have supper on." He cared for the horse first because that was who he was, and she had not expected otherwise. She finished the barn work alongside him in the comfortable parallel of people who have learned each other's rhythms, and neither of them spoke much. And the silence had the quality she recognized as the signature of a complete thing, a circuit that has found its other end. Spring came to the Hargrove Ranch with the extravagance of spring that follow hard winters. The fields greened, the kitchen garden went in early, and at twice the previous size. Ember the foal pulled from the burning barn, who had grown from a crumpled-eared, barely surviving scrap, into a long-limbed, opinionated young horse. With strong views about his own importance, was the ongoing subject of negotiation between his own instincts and Colt's patient instruction, a negotiation that appeared to be proceeding toward a mutually acceptable resolution. The county completed its case against Silas Greer in March. Fraudulent loan practices affecting multiple properties in the county. The Hargrove Ranch, the most thoroughly documented case. Substantial fines, the fraudulent fee assessments reversed with interest, banking license revoked by the state. Greer sold his house in Redstone and relocated to Kansas City, where Eliza suspected he would eventually become someone else's problem, but would not be theirs. She wrote the final entry on the matter in her journal date outcome resolution and closed the book and set it in the wooden box with the painted lid beside her parents' daguerreotype and the letter with "not yet" on the envelope. She had opened that letter in January and on a Sunday evening while the fire was burning down and the baby was conducting its nocturnal business and the wind was working at the eaves with its characteristic persistence. Her father had written it 3 months before he died in the clear, careful hand of a man who still believed in the future tense even when he had specific reasons to doubt it. "My Eliza, if you are reading this, then not yet has become now, which means you are wherever I tried to point you toward. I don't know R. Hargrove personally. I know the advertisement, and I know what I know about the kind of people who place such notices and the kind who answer them. The dishonest ones find easier roads. It's the desperate, honest ones who end up writing letters to strangers in Nebraska, and those tend to find each other because no one else would have them. I want you to have a life that is larger than the one I left you. Not easier, larger. You were always large enough for it. I have known this since you were 8 years old and argued with your schoolmaster about the classification of rivers and turned out to be right. Your mother knew it too. That is everything I have to say. I love you." DC, she had folded the letter and replaced it in the envelope and held it in her hands for a long time in the quiet of the January kitchen. Then she had put it in the box and closed the lid and gone to bed. Their daughter arrived on a Thursday evening in June in the way of long-awaited things preceded by the extensive preparation and sustained effort and the calm, competent attendance of Winifred Holt, who brought both her years of experience and her particular steadiness and deployed both with the assurance of someone who knows the territory. Colt did not leave the room. Eliza had not asked him to stay. She had been otherwise occupied with the more pressing considerations, but he was simply there in the way he was always simply there when it mattered, without requiring acknowledgement or direction. He held her hand when she wanted it held. He did not offer commentary on the proceedings. He kept his attention on her face with the quality of a man who has determined that what he is witnessing is the most significant event of his life and intends to be fully present for every moment of it. When Winifred placed the baby in Eliza's arms and the room received the child's first full-throated, committed announcement of her arrival, Colt made a sound that was not a word. Not grief, not exactly, though grief was in it, the particular grief of a man receiving something he had concluded over 7 careful years that he had no right to ask for a second time. Eliza looked down at her daughter, dark-haired as her father was. A quality about the eyes, even in those first unfocused minutes, of a person who is already taking stock of things and finding the situation interesting. Small and complete and entirely herself. Winifred left them alone with the quiet tact of a woman who understands when her work is done and when her presence has become a third thing in a room that only needs two. The room was quiet. The June evening held warmth. Outside, the ranch conducted its ordinary business, horses in the paddock, the garden in the last of the light, the fields running away toward a horizon still bright at the edge with the long dusk of a plain summer evening. Colt sat on the edge of the bed. He was looking at the baby with the expression that lives past wonder and before speech in the territory where the ordinary vocabulary of a person's face is simply not sufficient for what is being experienced, and the face does the best it can with what it has. "What would you like to call her?" he asked. His voice was rough and quiet, the voice of a man who has been through a significant amount of the day's emotional range and is arriving at the end of it, still present, still here. Eliza looked up at him. She had been thinking about this since October, in the practical mornings and the long evenings alone. She had considered names and set them aside and returned to one, always the same one, with the persistence of an answer that is already decided and is waiting for the question to arrive. "Sarah," she said. The name entered the room and stayed. Colt went absolutely still. Not the stillness of resistance, but the stillness of a large and quiet thing moving through a person the way a tide moves, changing everything it passes over without announcing its intention. His jaw moved once. His eyes fixed on her face let something through that was normally kept at a much greater remove. "Eliza." Her name and his voice barely audible. "She was the first woman you loved," Eliza said. "She gave you the capacity for this, for all of it. The love you brought to this marriage, the patience, the care, the way you are with me and will be with this child. She paid for something she never got to keep, and the thing she paid for has been living in you all this time." She looked at him directly. "She deserves to be part of what grew from it. That has always seemed right to me from the moment I first understood what her name meant to you." Colt bent forward on the edge of the bed, his elbows on his knees, his face going down into his hands. His shoulders moved once, the contained, private movement of a man who does not weep easily and is not performing it now, is simply unable in this particular moment to accommodate everything in the available space. Eliza reached out with her free hand and placed it on the back of his neck. She held it there and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was more useful than the weight of her hand and the warmth of it, and the fact of her being here in this room, which was their room, in this house, which was their house on this land, which they had built together from nothing but 30 days and $300, and 2 people who had each arrived at exactly the right moment of desperation and honesty. After a time, Colt straightened. He reached out and touched the baby's hand, his entire hand offered, so she could close her fingers around his index finger, which she did with the absolute unconditional conviction of a new person who has not yet learned to question the reliability of what she grasps. "Hello, Sarah," he said. His voice was steady, rough at the edges in the way that voices are after they have been through something, but steady underneath in the way that he was steady underneath everything. The kind of steadiness that is not the absence of feeling, but its integration into something that holds. The baby held his finger and made no objection to the arrangement. 7 years is long enough for certain things that were too close to see to become visible. By 1883, the Hargrove Ranch had grown from 40 acres to 110. The original house had been added to twice, first a second bedroom and then a proper kitchen with genuine workspace and room to move in it, which was what tended to happen when the people building something had learned from the limitations of what they started with. The barn was new, raised the summer after the fire on a better foundation into a better design, the improvement that comes from having been taught by a specific and instructive failure. Colt's horse breeding had developed a reputation that reached to Omaha, which was the kind of market reach that required you to take the enterprise seriously as a business rather than a sideline. People came considerable distances to see his animals. He had 3 sold at the county fair that year, at prices that would have seemed implausible to the man who had sat in the kitchen 7 years before looking at the number 300. The school in Redstone had a new classroom wing. Eliza had not built it with her hands, but she had organized the people and the money and the sustained municipal attention required to make it a real thing rather than an intention. And when the sign went up above the door, the Callaway classroom, established 1881, Winifred Holt had stood beside her in the autumn light and said nothing at all, which was exactly the right response. Sarah was 7, dark-haired with her father's quality of deliberate stillness and her mother's precision, and the particular combination of the two that produces a child who notices more than she says and says only what she has determined is worth the saying. She spent Saturday mornings in the barn with Colt learning the horses with the thoroughness of someone who intends to actually understand something rather than simply know about it, and he taught her with the same patient attention he brought to everything he cared about. Thomas was 5 broad through the shoulders already, with Eliza's appetite for questions and Colt's inclination to take on more than was strictly assigned to him. He followed Colt through the days with the dedicated proximity of a small person who has decided where the important things are being learned and intends to be present for them. Nell was 3 and had been conducting an enthusiastic and largely unsupervised campaign of investigation into every corner of the ranch and several corners outside it since approximately the week she had become ambulatory, and the family had adjusted its expectations and defensive arrangements accordingly, and with the affectionate resignation of people who would not, if given the choice, have it any other way. On a September evening in that 7th year, Eliza and Colt sat on the porch in the last warmth of the day, in the chairs they had put there 4 years before when they had added the porch extension and had been sitting in on evenings like this ever since, not because all the work was done, the work was never entirely done, but because they had built the practice of setting it down at this hour and allowing the day to be finished. The light was going amber and long across the fields, throwing the grass into relief, making the whole landscape look like something considered and composed rather than merely natural. The sky was deepening through its evening colors with the unhurried thoroughness of a plain sky that has all the space it needs and intends to use it. Colt was quiet, which was his ordinary mode. He was looking at the fields with the expression she had come to know as his looking at what we built expression present, considering the carrying something that was not pride exactly, but was in close kinship with it. The satisfaction of a man who has made something real with his hands and his patience in the sustained application of his best self and knows it. "I've been thinking about my father," Eliza said. He turned to look at her. "He left me that advertisement deliberately, under the receipts where he knew I would find it when I went through everything." She watched the light move across the grass in its slow characteristic wave. "I've wondered for 7 years what he knew. Whether he understood about the debt here, whether he had some information about you that I never found, or whether he was working purely on instinct and probability. What do you think?" "I think he was a man who believed in what he called the mathematics of desperation." She turned to Colt. "His words, I found them in the letter. He believed that desperate people, when they're honest, find each other because the dishonest ones find easier roads." She paused. "I think he understood something about how people arrive at each other that most people only figure out after the fact if they figure it out at all. And I think he decided to give us both a better chance than chance alone would have offered." Colt was quiet for a moment, looking at the darkening horizon. "I think about my father's advertisement sometimes," he said. The one he placed without asking me. He turned to look at her. When Renwick showed up with that summons, I thought about it, about all the things my father had arranged without telling me, convinced he knew better than I did what I needed. I was angry about it for a long time. He looked at his hands. I owe him an apology. He was right about all of it. Eliza reached over and placed her hand on his. Do you ever regret it? She asked. The way it started, the bargain, the arrangement, all the strangeness of it. He looked at her hand over his. Then he looked at the house behind them, where through the window, the lamplight made a warm rectangle against the darkening air, and the small sounds of children being managed towards sleep produced their familiar evidence of a household that has been genuinely and substantially lived in. Then he looked at the fields, at the 110 acres that had been 40 and failing, and were now this. I regret the 7 years before it, he said. 7 years of drifting and running and sleeping in other people's barns and telling myself I was suited to open country with no particular destination, because that was easier than admitting I was afraid of wanting anything again. He turned to look at her directly. I regret not finding you sooner. You couldn't have found me sooner, she said. I wasn't ready sooner. Neither were you. We needed all of it, the losses, the running, the specific shapes our grief had made us into. We needed to be exactly those people arriving at exactly that moment, or this would have been something different and less. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said, I believe that. From inside the house, Sarah's patient older sibling voice conducting some negotiation with Nell, followed by Thomas's contribution, followed by a silence that suggested the matter had been resolved, or at least adjourned. Colt's mouth moved at the corner in the way it had the incomplete smile that meant something had reached him that he was too constitutionally restrained to express fully, and which she had always found more genuinely expressive than any complete smile would have been. What are you thinking? And he asked. I'm thinking about the woman who got off that train, Eliza said. The one with the single trunk and the borrowed courage, and absolutely no clear idea what she was walking into. She looked out at the fields, at the land that she knew now as she knew her own hands. I don't think she understood when she wrote that letter that she was writing toward all of this. I think she believed she was escaping, running toward the only door that wasn't already closed. Was she wrong? Eliza considered this in the way she considered things that deserved her full attention, not quickly, not for performance, but actually. The evening deepened around them. The amber became rose, became the first deep blue of a plain's dusk. The hawk that lived in the cottonwood at the north fence made its final pass of the day and folded itself into the tree with the air of something completing its obligations. The horses in the paddock made the sounds of large animals making their peace with the end of a working day. Somewhere to the north, a coyote offered its opinion on the proceedings, and the opinion went unanswered. She was wrong about what she was doing, Eliza said at last. She thought she was running away. She was actually arriving. She looked at Colt. She just couldn't tell the difference until she had made the whole journey. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, the quiet, deliberate gesture that was his signature, the gesture of a man who communicates most truly through what he does and who has made his peace over the course of a life that had not been easy, with that being enough. We're still arriving, he said. Every day, we're still arriving somewhere new. Every day, she agreed. The stars appeared above the Hargrove Ranch the way they always appeared on clear plains nights. Not gradually, but as a revelation all at once. Once the darkness was sufficient, the whole of it suddenly there, as if it had been waiting for the light to step aside. Inside the house, the lamp burned in the kitchen window, warm and steady, the way it had burned through 3 Nebraska winters and everything those winters had contained. The fields lay quiet in the dark, holding in their turned soil the work of 7 years, the fences and the crops and the water, and the careful, patient attention of 2 people who had decided separately and then together that this land was worth the building. On the porch of the house they had made from 30 days and $300, and the specific, irreplaceable combination of who they each were and what they each needed, Colt and Eliza Hargrove sat in the September evening and watched their land in the growing dark and did not feel the need for more words than they had already given each other. The best things never do. They simply need to be lived day by day, arriving somewhere new.